the Undistracted podcast. It is an absolute pleasure to be joined by Michael Schur. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Your new book, How to Be Perfect, the correct answer to every moral question. It really is such a great read, but it does beg the question for me, why does this question of how to be perfect, how to be good intrigue you so much?
I don't know. I was always a very dutiful little child. I was always a rule follower. I did all my homework on time. I never skipped school. Like I just sort of like did whatever people in authority told me to do, which is good when you're a kid and less good, I think, when you're a grown up. But I've always been like wary of breaking rules or worried about breaking rules. So it's clearly it's inside me somewhere from birth. And then over time, I just found myself over in the course of my life in a bunch of different situations where I blew it very badly. I did something wrong or bad. I was aware that I had caused pain or anguish or sadness to another person or people. And when that would happen, as it happens to all of us, my overwhelming feeling was like, why did I do this? What is wrong with me? And so there's basically two things you can do when you have that feeling. One of them is go to therapy, which I also did and which I highly recommend to everyone. But also I started reading theories about ethics and moral philosophy and beginning to learn just the basics of like what these theories were, what they said, how they function, so that I could at least have some kind of vocabulary to describe my behavior, which I found very comforting.
And there's a sense then that you really think about your role in the world and the reasons behind wanting to be good and hopefully not wanting to be bad. Why does that matter to you so much to consider your role in the world?
Well, I don't know what else there is to do, really. Like I keep coming back to this same feeling over and over again, which is like, if you don't care about that, then what do you care about? Like there are superficial things that we need to care about or do care about. And there are certainly necessities that we have to care about, right? There are basics of human life. Like, do you have food and water and shelter and clothing and stuff? Like, of course, there's all of that stuff. And there is an enormously wide range on the planet Earth in terms of how much those things cause us fear or tension or anxiety. So putting aside that stuff for a second, other than that, I just don't know what you care about. Like if you don't care about whether what you're doing is good or bad, then you're already kind of lost in some way, because that's kind of all there is, at least in my view. Like I understand I'm making this argument from a point of privilege in the sense that I don't have to worry about food or clothing or shelter or any of those things. I don't have to worry about I'm a white dude in America. Like I don't have to worry about being oppressed by anyone. Like I am zero oppression risk at this point in my life. So I understand that like like you can only make this argument if you feel safe in these other arenas. But once you do, to some degree, I just think that it's how we treat other people begins to become the most important question that we face, I think.
Well, and for those that aren't really oppressed, and that can actually recognize the privilege that we stand in, I guess that then becomes meaningful when you actually use that privilege for good or do something meaningful, purposeful with it.
Yeah, of course. And to a large extent, these questions of how we treat other people and whether what we're doing is good or bad come into play when you're talking about tiny little incidents that you have between you and another person fighting over a parking space. And then it ranges all the way up to the biggest questions that we face in terms of public policy and civics and like how we pass laws, what we stand for as a people, as a nation, as all those sorts of things. What are the ways that we have chosen to treat other people in individual ways and in gigantic systemic ways? So and it's the same, you're asking the same questions. Like that's what's really fascinating to me, is like when you're talking about basic rules of ethics or behavior, whether you're fighting over a parking space with someone or you're talking about what laws we should pass as a society that govern the way that people are put in prison for crimes or whatever, it's the roots of those questions are exactly the same. So if you have some kind of understanding or theory that you're applying to your basic tiny level behavior, and you apply those same rules to this gigantic systemic behavior, you're going to get to the same place, which is just consideration for other people and valuing the lives of other people as much as your own, no matter who you are, all those sorts of things. So that's why it matters to me that you care about something as small as, do I put my shopping cart back in the shopping cart corral when I'm done grocery shopping? It's because the answer to that question will lead you to a conclusion that is also applicable to these much bigger issues.
Yeah, it's the basics of caring for another person. And I feel like we often get these kind of icons of morality that we take some of our examples of how to live from. You know, I think of Martin Luther King Jr. or your Mother Teresa's, right? They were people who fought for the gap of injustice, I suppose, to be closed. But I wonder then, from your perspective, why do you think some people like that? Why does their goodness seem to stand out above other people's? Because in those cases, they're not the only people fighting for racial equality. They're not the only people caring for the poor. And yet they seem to stand so far above so many other people with those goals. Why does their goodness stand out?
Well, some of it is probably simply charisma, right? Like the people who are better than other people at just relaying their ideas because they're captivating speakers, or they are in the right place at the right time and capitalize on those moments and have the ability to really make people listen, which is a rare skill. Like Martin Luther King Jr., Barack Obama, these people are, Robert Kennedy, these people are once in a generation speakers and motivators of people. And then also they're speaking largely at times when the country, at least in this country, was sort of galvanized towards caring about this cause in a new way, in part because of them, right? In part because they're good at speech. Becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I think it's probably nothing more complicated than there are ideas that are out there in the ether that are very that are real, but that are also diffuse and a little vague and a little bit, people in a complicated world are wondering all the time, like, okay, I get it. Like, I get that I'm supposed to be good, but how? Like, what do I actually do? And so when Martin Luther King Jr. comes along and he says, we're going to march to this place and we're going to talk about this issue, and here are the tangible things that you can do or that we can stand for to affect change. Like, when people have plans, and actually can say, like, this is your call to action, this is how we're going to change this problem into a solution. That's a very rare talent that people can kind of pull these like vague ideas out of the ether and kind of make them concrete for people. So it's a lot of stuff. I think that, of course, what happens ultimately is that a lot of people, like you say, who have similar ideas or are doing just as much in some cases to affect change, they kind of get lost in history because at least in America, like, we're obsessed with celebrity in this country. So like Martin Luther King Jr. is always going to stand in for an enormous movement that involved tens of thousands of people, all of whom did vital work in advancing civil rights. But anyone ever says is, remember how Martin Luther King said, I have a dream? That's what we're talking about. Like, he just became an avatar. And of course, then, just side note, that speech gets twisted and mangled and used for things that it has no business being used for by corrupt politicians who were like, I care about people. And then so they quote, I have a dream once a year, and then think they're done. Yeah. So it's over time, these things just get lost and twisted and bent around, and we all forget about all of the important people who are doing important work.
Yeah, there's probably a lesson of marketing in there somewhere. We need a plan, we need a celebrity, we need a catchy phrase, and a movement can kind of take off. Do you think it matters more whether we have intention to do good then, and that we do align ourselves maybe with these ideas, or is it more important to actually take action? What is more moral?
Well, I argue a lot in the book that the intention is the key, that you have to, that anything good that happens begins with literally just caring one way or the other, whether or not you're a good person. Like, because that's not an easy thing to do. It takes time and energy and effort, and it requires essentially a lifetime commitment. Like, you have to care about it. You don't just care about it today and then you're done for the month. You care about it, like, you have to care about it all the time. It's not an easy thing to do. And so I would say the first step, and I think the more difficult step in some cases, is the intention, is the caring about whether you're a good person or not. After that, of course, yeah, you have to follow through. You can't just say you care about it and not do anything. It's just that I think that when it comes to things like ethical behavior, there's a misunderstanding or a misapprehension that caring, that once you get beyond the intention, that the action has to fall into some kind of small category. It's like, I have to volunteer at a soup kitchen, or I have to give more money to charity or something like that. There is an enormously wide range of actions that anyone can do on a day-to-day basis in very big and small ways that would be an improvement over whatever the hell you're doing now. So I think that I think the caring is the bigger step, but I think oftentimes the action is hindered by people thinking like, well, I don't have time to volunteer at a soup kitchen, so there's no point in trying to do anything good. But that's not, there are thousands and thousands of ways, down to like just literally caring more about, say, what products you buy and where you buy them from. That the simple act of really thinking and caring about that, I think would be a way for people to improve their moral standing in the world. And I say this as a person who buys stuff from Amazon all the time. Like I am in no way suggesting that I have like solved that problem. Like there are certain moments in your life, of course, when like the convenience that a store like Amazon provides is too good to pass up, or you just don't have the time to put in the research or whatever. So you're gonna blow it. You're gonna, even if you care, even if you try to take that step, you're still gonna blow it. But that's why I think the caring and the intention is more important, because if you have the intention, if you are thinking through this stuff in a way that maybe you didn't used to, at least when you blow it, you'll be like, okay, this isn't ideal. And the next time, if I have a little more time, or I plan ahead better and I can afford to buy something and not get it in 30 seconds delivered to my house, then I will choose a different path. Like that's where the intention really matters, I think, is in the like evaluation of what you've done and why you did it, and whether there's something you could do that's better.
And intention is probably a little bit more, I would say, not necessarily hard to develop, but it's probably more about character, whereas action can be a little bit more for show, or it has that risk of being for how you're going to be perceived. Whereas intention, you've had to actually do some work to develop that care in you if it's something that you struggle with.
Yes, absolutely. And in The Good Place, which is the show I created that sort of from where this book sprung, there was a character named Tahani, played by Jamila Jamil, who was obsessed with her public perception. And so she did a bunch of great things. She raised billions of dollars for charity, and she was always throwing these lavish luncheons and kind of directing, flying all over the world and like doing all this stuff for nonprofits. But she ended up in, spoiler alert, she ended up in The Bad Place, in part because the intention was always wrong. The intention was to garner fame and attention and you know, show up her sister who she had a rivalry with and all this sort of stuff. So all the stuff she was doing, most philosophers would say some philosophers would say didn't have a lot of moral value, because the intention was corrupt. So yeah, that is I think you're right. Like the intention, if the intention is pure, whatever the action is, it's more forgivable when it goes awry.
And The Good Place has been such a fantastic example of how, for one, comedy can be used to deal with philosophy and make it interesting, make it fun, but it also deals with these big questions. You know, what happens when we die? Is someone counting the points of our goodness and badness in life? Big question. What do you think, or what impact do you think a belief in God has on our perceptions of philosophy and morality?
It's a good question. And the answer is a little bit sort of your mileage may vary, I guess, or it's an individual feeling. I mean, there have been wonderful and very important moral philosophers who argued purely from religious grounds, right? The Soren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, was a Christian, and all of his writing is Christian. St. Thomas Aquinas, all the great philosophers from the Catholic tradition. So I think it's just a different organizing principle, right? If you're asking questions about what's good and bad behavior, implied in that is, well, who's going to punish you if you do something bad? And if you're a secular philosopher, you're basically saying like, well, the punishment is that the world you live in is worse, right? Your interactions and relationships with people are worse, and you are seen by your peers as a uncaring or ungenerous or unthoughtful person. And the fabric of society kind of gets all screwed up. If you're a religious philosopher, in many cases, you're sort of saying like, well, God is going to judge you. Like, you're going to do all this bad stuff, and then you're going to get into the afterlife, and there's going to be a guy weighing your soul and find your soul lacking. So it's obviously, this is incredibly reductive, and I am by no means an expert either on religious philosophy or secular philosophy, but I think it's just a different kind of way of trying to answer the question, what happens when you do something bad? Who is judging you, and how are you being judged? And the book is largely, in fact, and really entirely secular. I really focus only on secular thought. But I also, the religious thinkers are fascinating and well worth reading. And, Kierkegaard is often credited with starting the existentialist movement in philosophy, which really didn't, when you think of existentialists, you think of it's 1942 and Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus are smoking cigarettes in a cafe in Paris with Simone de Beauvoir. But really, existentialism started in the 19th century with not only Kierkegaard, but like Dostoevsky. Some of the Russian philosophers are credited with it. So there has been a lot of really important thinking done by religious philosophers for a very long time. And I think it's literally just like they're climbing the same mountain. They're just climbing it on two different faces, and they're aiming towards the same place.
And they're all starting from this position of the human side of ethics, which is something you really bring up, that as humans, we do want to have an understanding of what is right, what is wrong, what does happen when we do something bad, and how do we work it all out. And I think you do create that, or you at least show that theme of humanity within ethics.
Yeah, that, to me, that's what is joyous about it, honestly, is the questions, whether whoever's judging you or whatever school of thought you're using, like, it's humans thinking about other humans in a way that I find very lovely. Like, the book is dedicated to essentially everyone who's ever thought about this stuff.
Yeah.
Because to me, it's just like the most sort of beautiful and noble conversation that's been had by humans. Is at some point a really long time ago, some group of fairly primitive humans started thinking about ethics, started thinking about like, how can we be nicer to each other? How can we treat each other better? Like, what are some ways we can think about to cooperate and to kind of understand each other when we have a conflict? And we've been talking about it ever since. I mean, tens of thousands of years we've been talking about the same subject. And I just find it, I find a lot of the beauty, say, of scientific writing, of the history of scientific writing, to be mind-blowing. Like the people who made these enormous leaps in the way we understand the universe and the atom and all this stuff, it's beautiful and majestic, and it says so much about the human ability to just think and use our brains. And the same is true with poetry and with literature and with painting, with all of these different art forms. But I think the conversation about ethics is the most human conversation that we've had. Because it's only about who are we, what are we doing, how can we do it better with each other. And I think it's rapturous. I can't get enough of it.
And maybe it's their primitiveness that worked in their favor, because they had a little bit more time to think about these questions compared to what it feels like we have in this day and age. But we've talked about The Good Place, and I think your other shows, Parks and Rec, The Office, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, you're working out these questions in comedic environments, but there is also this connection of workplace ethics that you see there as well. Why is the workplace somewhere that you love to kind of flesh out these sorts of conversations?
Well, I think that in the world we live in now, it's possible, and obviously for the last couple of years, it's been required, that we spend a lot of our time alone. You can go through, even without the pandemic, you can go a fairly long time without seeing anyone else, without running into anyone else. You can order your groceries to your house, and you can drive around in your car and listen to whatever music you want to listen to, and pump gas if you need to, and drive to drive through and just order food and pick it up and eat it in your car and drive home, and you can just be alone. Like,
Yeah.
the world has conspired to make it so that being alone is more possible now than it's ever been, heightened by the pandemic, which forced us all to Zoom into work and to never actually sit in a place with another person. A workplace is a place for most of us, for many of us, where you have to be around other people. And those other people are frequently annoying. Like, they have personality traits and quirks, and they put art on their cubicle walls that you hate, and they don't clean out the microwave when they use the microwave, and like they do all these things that just cause you a little tiny bit of anguish or agony or sadness or whatever. And we only focus on the negative side of that, right? Like, all we think about is like, I have to go to work tomorrow and Dave is going to be there, and I hate Dave. Dave is so annoying, and he doesn't brush his teeth, and he always wears that stupid yellow tie, and blah, 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 blah. Like, because of course you do, because you're spending 8 hours, you're spending a third of your day around a bunch of people you didn't choose to spend the time with, and with whom you have a lot of little tiny disagreements, right? I like to think about, when it comes to ethics, the good part of that, which is we're supposed to be around other people. That's how we were designed. And also, being around other people who aren't the people you self-selected, who aren't your own radio station playing your own music, is a way for us to practice the art of negotiating with other people. It's a way for us to say, okay, Dave is not my best friend. Dave and I didn't go to high school together. Dave was not the best man at my wedding. Dave has a million little annoying peccadillos that drive me up the wall, but I have to spend 8 hours a day right next to Dave. And so how am I going to figure out a way to just work around that, and to sort of give a little bit when he is asking for more space on his desk, and maybe get a little better at asking him to back off in certain ways that annoy me. Like, it's a laboratory. Like, workplaces are laboratories where humans mill around and bump into each other and essentially conduct experiments on each other.
Yeah.
And I think that I think losing that is bad. I think that we need that practice in order to just remember that we're not alone on earth, and we can't program the whole world like it's our own radio station playing only our music.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of people listening who, in these gradual moments of going back to work face to face, have kind of felt that of just, wow, being alone was really nice. And my goodness, I'm out of practice being with all my colleagues. But here's a workplace dilemma for you then, as the arbiter of what is morally right and wrong. What would you do in this situation? Okay, so everyone hates emails, right? You do not want more emails in your inbox, but if your colleague or a business associate does something so nice for you, they've, lined up a connection, a meeting, whatever, and you send that simple reply of thank you, do you send the thank you reply knowing that you have just added one more email to your associate's inbox that is 2 words, they're going to have to read it, open it, delete it? Or do you be the person who doesn't say thank you, but also doesn't add one more email notification to that person's inbox?
I think that that not emailing the person back to say thank you is a bigger risk, because I think when you do something nice for someone, whatever it is, big or small, you want to know 2 things. Number one, that it worked. Like, that if you send an email and say, hey, I set up this meeting for you with this person who's looking for a new vice president of marketing and development, and you hear nothing, there's a certain amount of anxiety of like, did they get the email? Like, do I now have to check in? Do I have, hey, just making sure you got this kind of thing? So the response, which yes, is annoying, there's another email in your inbox, but the response is a little bit of gratitude. It's a little bit of like, I'm easing your anxiety about whether or not I receive this. And also, I would say that even though, yes, we're all annoyed every time an email shows up that just says thank you or whatever, I think that the simple act of saying thank you and showing gratitude for when someone does something nice for you is important. And I think it closes a little bit of a loop, and like, the person's going to see that it says thank you, delete it. They might even think like, ugh, that person didn't need to email me back. But if you didn't, they might have a different anxiety, which is like, did that message get through? Did they see it? Do I need to send a follow-up? Blah, 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 blah. So even though it can be irritating, I think it's a lesser irritation than not responding at all.
All right, that answer has been filed away for future use. But these are the kind of things that people really sort of tie themselves up over, I think, and knowing what the right thing to do is in these kind of situations. So for you personally, then, when things are, particularly as someone who really wants to be good, when all of these questions and all of these things get a little bit much, is there something that you use to really ground yourself and to lift a bit of that pressure of being perfect off?
Yes, and his name is Aristotle, and he lived to 2,400 years ago, because Aristotle's theory, which was called virtue ethics, in contemporarily called virtue ethics, he basically said the way to do this is trial and error. There is a certain amount of all these different qualities, generosity and kindness and magnanimity and courage and whatever. There's a certain amount that's the right amount. And your job is to find it. And the way you find it is you do something, and then you kind of check in with yourself and you think, was I courageous enough just now? Was I not courageous enough? Like, did I blow it by having too little of that quality or too much? And then you do your little analysis. And then the next time you're in a similar situation, you try again and you do the same analysis. And basically, to me, it's the most humane of all of the theories, because he is acknowledging, A, this is really hard. Like, this is really hard. You're not going to get it right the first time. You're not going to get it right the millionth time. And B, he allows you to stir into the pot there some qualities that we might think of as bad qualities. Like if you're too courageous in a certain moment, Aristotle will say, no, be a little more cowardly. Like, that's too courageous. Like, stir in a little more cowardice, because you've got to get back to that dead solid middle ground, right? So whenever I blow it, I lean on him in my brain, because he's the guy who is like, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. Like, your journey is to try and fail over and over again. And as long as you're sort of thinking about what you did and wondering whether what you did was the right amount or not the right amount of whatever that quality is, then you're doing great. Then you're on the right path. So that is a way I think that you can care about this stuff, but also not live like the character Chidi did in The Good Place, in a constant state of frazzled anxiety that you're going to do the wrong thing, because Aristotle knows you're going to do the wrong thing. And all he cares about is whether or not you then do your own little evaluation of why it was wrong and how you might be less wrong the next time you try to do something similar.
On our journey to working it out, though, and I suppose thinking of the things that we want to do and what the right choices are to make, we're always going to come up against people who disagree with us. And even in the writer's room on The Good Place, you've got so many different minds there tinkering on what the characters are like and what they should and shouldn't do. When you're in a space like that with different views, whether it's in a workplace environment or just in day-to-day life, in our social media environments, what are some of the skills you used to debate well and have those kind of conversations without anyone pulling out their hair? Or maybe they did.
Yeah, everybody always pulls out their hair in any debate nowadays. But I think there's two slightly different answers. In something that's a collaborative, creative endeavor, like a TV show, it's very easy to open the floor for ideas and to sort of like let all the ideas just wash over everybody, and then have a group debate or discussion about which are the best ideas. I mean, obviously, at some point, somebody's got to say, okay, this is the idea we're going with. But it's actually really necessary that you let everybody talk and everybody's got to weigh in, because that's the only way to get to the best ideas. You have to come up with 1,000 ideas before you get to the one that you're sure is, or at least relatively sure is the right one, because it's ethereal, right? It's not like someone pitches a joke and an alarm bell goes off that indicates that's the good joke that you should use. Like, it's just a million ideas being thrown out all the time. And then I kind of like, well, which are the ones that just feel at a gut level like they're the best jokes or the best story points or whatever. That's easier to do in a group collaborative thing like a TV show. It's harder to do, I would imagine, if you're in a more hierarchical situation. Like, that's not the way the army works, right? Like, the army works by the person who's the senior ranking officer saying, we're doing this now, and everyone says, yes, sir, and then you do it. So it's very context dependent, I would say. But the closer that you can get, I would say, to to that sort of sense of group collaboration, the more fruitful it will be for two reasons. One is the more ideas, the more chance that someone comes up with a good one. But also, I think one of the things that people, that drives people the craziest is when they feel like their work is pointless, right? That's like when you feel like you're just, there's no one's listening to you, nobody hears you, no one values your input, no one is taking you seriously. Like that can be one of the most demeaning and ultimately destructive environments for a person to work in. So whether or not it's a TV show or you're a senior account manager at an accounting firm or whatever, the thing that you can do to cause the most immediate and irreparable damage with one of your employees is to make them feel valueless and make like they don't matter. So I think it's obviously these things differ from job to job and from industry to industry, but the more you can make people genuinely, not for show, but genuinely feel like their ideas are being listened to and valued, the better off everyone will be. Because I genuinely believe that people can't do a good job at anything unless they feel kind of safe and protected and happy and like their work has value. So that's the ultimate goal in whatever job I think anybody's ever working in.
Basically adopting the lost art of listening, essentially.
Yes, 100%. Listening and caring, like listening, not just like you can talk for 30 seconds and then regardless of what you say, I'm cutting you off and we're moving on to my idea. That's the bad kind of listening. But the good kind of listening is like, we have a problem in this little team and who's got an idea, and we're going to listen to everybody's idea and try to figure out what the best one is.
And this question maybe comes to the person who does feel a little bit sort of torn between what causes to fight for and what voices to really listen to, especially in this day and age. There is so many things that we can put our best efforts and our care behind. In your book, you do ask this really important question, though, of if there's a really good cause, for instance, but the person who is elevating that cause has some kind of personal failure, or there's something about them that doesn't kind of line up with this great thing at the front. Do we still do the great thing, or do we abandon that person in spite of what good they could do? That might be a little bit of a confusing way to put that, but this question of how closely, I'll read it straight from your book, how closely should the morality of a person be linked to our interest in the work they do? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I'm talking less about like charitable enterprises there, and more about like directors or musicians or painters or whoever, people who have created something that's valuable to you and meaningful to you, who then are revealed to be deeply flawed people. Like essentially it's, can you separate the art from the artist? Can you look at a Picasso painting and find it beautiful, knowing what you know about what kind of person Picasso was, or Eric Clapton, or R. Kelly, or whoever, right? Like that. And this is a problem that it's not unique to our age, but we are so aware of it now. We know so much more about so many more people that I'm sure most of us, me included, wished at some level that we could erase from our memories, because it would make it so much more fun to listen to the radio or watch movies if we didn't have to also contemplate the horrifying things that certain people have done. So this was the hardest chapter in the book to write, honestly, because I don't think there's an obvious answer. I don't even think philosophers have a good answer for this. The closest I can get to an answer is that if there's a person, let's say there's a musician whose music was so important to you that it's not just like, oh, I love that guy, I love that song he wrote, but it's like, as a child, like you listen to this person's music at the worst moments of your life, and it helped you overcome great sadnesses in your life. And you can't imagine a universe in which you could, click one of those Men in Black memory erasey things and just remove the existence of this musician from your life, because it would be too painful. If that is the case, then I argue you can carve out a spot in your life for that person's music. The thing you can't do is pretend that that person is not problematic. Like that's where I think the trick is, because if you ignore the fact that that person is problematic and has caused some amount of significant pain or just committed some horrible crime to some other person, you're essentially just giving him a free pass, right? You're
Mm.
saying like, it doesn't matter that you did those things. I'm going to unconditionally support you anyway. So the simple act of holding those two things in your head at the same time, I love this person's music, and also this person did things that are terrible.
Mm.
It makes it less fun to listen to that person's music, right? Like it's not quite as like purely enjoyable, but that is the price that we pay for caring about famous people, essentially.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's like sorry, that's the deal that you make when you emotionally invest in a sports team or a musician or a director or an actor or a writer or whatever. When you emotionally invest in that person, you can't pick and choose what parts of that person's life you're emotionally investing in.
And maybe it just comes back to how much talent they have and the cultural implications of it, right? Like, for instance, Michael Jackson, it's like his music is just so good. So you're never going to completely get rid of it. But then there are people that have questions about his personal life. But maybe if he was not so great of an artist, he would be gone already and no one would really mind.
Yeah, look, if Michael Jackson hadn't written Off the Wall and Thriller and all those other albums, and he was just like a middling musician, like no one would have a problem getting rid of him from your cultural life. Like it would be easy. Like I kind of sucked anyway, so let's just forget the stuff. But he's a good example because the things he did are pretty unforgivable. You're talking about sexual crimes related to children. And you can take everything you want into account, his upbringing, his trauma that he suffered as a child, all of that stuff. Like you can add it all, lump it all in there, like look at the entire picture. But for thousands, if not millions of people, he's the greatest entertainer of all time. And so the thought of like, if a Michael Jackson song comes on the radio, you have to immediately turn it off or you're a bad person. I don't think that's the case. I really don't. But I also think that the way that you can run afoul in an ethical sense is by saying, I'm going to listen to his music and I'm going to publicly defend him. And I don't care. I'm not even going to think about what he did. I'm going to pretend it never happened. I'm going to excise that part of his life out of my memory. That's where it's like, well, now that's not fair, because now you are basically telling the people who suffered sadness and pain and anguish at his hands that you don't care about them, and you ought to care about them at least as much as you care about him.
I got two questions then for you, Michael. One is on the issue of making mistakes, because all of us will make mistakes. All of us will have moral failings to varying degrees. When you're that person who has made a mistake, or even someone else has pointed it out in you, what do you do? How do you resolve your own flaws and those of somebody else?
Well, this is like the thing that humans are the worst at. Of all of the stuff we're bad at, I think the thing we're worst at is like admitting fault, like no one ever, at least no one in public life, and really no one in private life, wants to ever say like, you're right, I blew it, I'm sorry. Like it's so hard to do that. And again, I will say, I am not exempting myself from this. I'm pretty bad at it. I dig in my heels like everybody else. I get defensive like everybody else. Like there's an instinct when someone points out that you've made a mistake. The instinct is to try to prove that you in fact have not, that you are actually you're right and they're wrong, because admitting that you're wrong is embarrassing and your face gets all hot and you start sweating and you think about how shameful it is that you've done whatever the thing is that you've done. So it's really I really believe it's the thing we are worst at, on a small scale, not on a global, we're also bad at like not killing the planet, but in terms of like base level human interactions, it's really, really, really difficult. And so I like to think I'm better at it now than I was in my previous life. I think I am. I'm very, very far from perfect in this regard. I think the thing to do is, instead of reacting in the moment, like instead of having a like immediate, like I'm going to yell at you kind of a reaction, what I like to try to do when I'm thinking clearly is like take a breath, look over the situation, try to figure out whether or not I did indeed blow it. And then if I did, just take a deep breath and suck it up and say, I'm really sorry. I didn't intend that, but I caused you some pain and I apologize. And I write about this in the book too. Like there are better and worse ways to apologize. We're pretty familiar at this point with the bad ways, because they're the only ways you ever see apologies, really, which is, I'm sorry if you were offended, or I'm sorry you feel that way, which is like, those are all half measure apologies, which are indicating that actually it's your fault for this whole thing is your fault for feeling a certain way. So that's another thing you can do, is like learn just what an apology really is, what it's supposed to do, and how to do a good one.
Yeah, and maybe knowing that we're all a little bit bad at it, extending a bit of grace to others as well. And I was going to say, there's a whole chapter in the book on this, if people do want to kind of read it, take notes. But Michael, as we wrap it up, I want to ask you a question that I do put to many of our guests. This is a podcast about building your life around the things that you value and purpose. And I suppose in this conversation, these ideas of good and trying to put your life in the direction of making good decisions, what would it mean to you, with that in mind, to live an undistracted life?
I mean,
which is maybe a virtue in and of itself, being undistracted.
Can I ask what you mean by an undistracted life? Like a life of like purity and sort of.
It's kind of however you interpret it, but it's kind of the idea of being undistracted, taking the things away or getting them out of the way from living your life on purpose. So if you feel like, for instance, your purpose is to be the greatest screenwriter in Hollywood, then how do you stay undistracted and keep focused on that thing?
I think that's the trick about me in particular answering this, because screenwriting, TV writing in particular, almost requires a certain amount of distraction. Like, it's not a solitary pursuit. It's a collaborative effort. It requires many, many hours spent with other people. And very frequently I have found in my life, not just the joy of it or the fun of it, but the actual mechanism of it requires you to like waste a lot of time. Like, you are in a writer's room with a bunch of writers and someone says, did anyone see this dumb YouTube video of this guy stepping on a rake or whatever? And you watch that video and it's really funny. And then that leads you to another video. And then someone says, oh my God, did anyone see this person's ridiculous post on Instagram? And you follow this kind of wormhole mentality and disappear into the ether of the internet for a while, or whatever it is that you're doing. And that can somehow very frequently be the thing that loosens everybody up and gets creative juices flowing and breaks you out of a rut that you're in. So distraction is a weirdly key element, I think, of TV writing. So I think the closest I guess I would say to wanting to live an undistracted life would be if I could personally stop caring about the stuff that really doesn't matter and isn't helping me be a better screenwriter. And those are the same sorts of annoyances that we all have about our day-to-day lives, or about like the things our kids do that annoy us or whatever. But even those, like, as I'm saying that, like, how many great TV shows have been written about families that have used their kids' real life annoying attributes as fodder for this story, that TV is a medium that is supposed to reflect the mood of the country or the world. And it's supposed to be a personal thing where the more specific you are about your own experiences, somehow magically, the more universal those stories become. So I think what I would have to say is I don't want to live an undistracted life. I kind of need distraction and mundanity and stuff that doesn't matter, because ultimately for my particular job, it actually does matter.
I
Maybe
really
that's a
like
cop-out. I don't know if that's a cop-out answer.
No, I really like that answer, because I think in this idea of being undistracted, we can really put a lot of pressure on ourselves to think that looks a particular way, or that, even as you asked, is that like the life of a monk? And maybe not. Maybe it's actually embracing these things that actually stir creativity and stir our unique passions, whatever they may be. So Michael, thank you so much for your thoughts. I really appreciate it and your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.